Thank you for joining us with Kevin Roberts. This may not be the last advance, but it is the last one at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're here today with the tables a bit turned. Dr. Roberts will be the interviewee for this special edition of the advance. You all know Kevin, but it's worth going over a few points of his biography. He is a native of Louisiana. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of Texas at Austin, which is a minor football school these days. Went on to found St. John Paul the Great Academy in Lafayette, went on to the presidency of Wyoming Catholic College, where the New York Times condemned him as a cowboy Catholic, which went promptly on his resume, I'm sure. And for the past 5 years has been the president of the Texas Public Policy Foundation right here in Austin, Texas. I think it's fair to say that when Dr. Roberts assumed the presidency of the foundation in 2016, we assumed that he would do well. We did not know the extent to which he would take us from great to greater. So I actually want to begin with an acknowledgement of the work that you've done here at the foundation, and thank you for an amazing half decade. That should have been for the close, but it comes forth. We're here today to talk a little bit prior to your ascent to the presidency of the Heritage Foundation, which is a small DC think tank, I'm given to understand, to talk a little bit about the future of conservatism, which I think is fair to say is your motivating force in your professional life. Second to faith and family, you are a man of the conservative movement. Tell me if you disagree. I think that's a fair estimation. And all the great things the conservative movement has done for the country and will do for the country are really, in many ways, embodied in your work. So let's talk about that movement. And I want to start, getting directly into it. Contrast the past decade, where we've come from and where we've been. Right now, it's November 2021. In November 2011, the movement was at some place very, very different. Talk about where we've been and what made it so.
Well, thanks, Josh, for that warm introduction, for being a great colleague and friend these last several years. Friendship, of course, will continue as that will with all of our colleagues here at TPPF. But to answer your question about the conservative movement, yes, I consider myself a son of the conservative movement, which is to say that even though I have fancy initials after my name and I've studied the history of the conservative movement, first and foremost, I'm a son of the conservative movement because conservatism provides the impetus, the rationale, the parameters in which I go about my life as an American, as a dad, as a husband. And I think that, as Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke would remind us, that in times like we live, which are nothing short than of chaotic, that conservatism gives us something that tethers us to the permanent things. And by that, I mean, in the middle of a tumultuous aftermath of a presidential election, we still need to be neighbors. We still need to live in community. We still ought to go to church. We still need to be active in the institutions of civil society. And then when we're thinking about public policy, this is really crucial for the next decade. And I see that smirk on your face. I think there's a follow-up question coming. When it comes to public policy, we need to remember that our policy prescriptions have to be tethered to those permanent things too. Just because it's fashionable, just because it sounds good, just because it makes us feel good to get that frustration off our chest, does not mean that the federal government needs to do it. It's crucial for us as conservatives to draw a line in the sand when it comes to that.
I want to ask a follow-up question. Unfortunately, it's not a smirk. This is just how I look, which is
really?
a burden,
Okay.
A burden that I bear.
Oh, I was giving myself a compliment. I said I got him to smirk early in our conversation.
But you did generate a follow-up question.
Okay, good.
Conservatives' relationship to state power has changed a great deal, particularly in the past half decade since you've been leading the foundation. We went from essentially and I'm going to overgeneralize, but I think it's a defensible overgeneralization. Essentially a libertarian conception of state power, which is that the market should take the fore. But I don't think that's a majoritarian view in the conservative movement anymore. Can you talk a little bit about that? And as you do, what do you think the guardrails ought to be?
Well, that's right. And it goes back to the first part of your first question. So I'll continue to, or try to weave responses to both of those. In 2011, for example, conservatives, to the extent there was tension in the movement, and there always has been, because we allow tension in our movement, the tension was between libertarians and not libertarians, both of them being conservatives. And I'll at the risk of overgeneralizing, not go into a lot of description there, but the point is there was a general agreement that the free market was ascendant and that the free market was, in fact, the solution to almost every public policy problem facing Americans. It is absolutely clear to me that right now, that's no longer the consensus among conservatives. And I'm going to pause in assessing the wisdom of that, but it is obvious to me that there are some conservatives now, some people who want to put certain adjectives in front of the word conservative, which I would always caution against, who no longer believe the free market is the answer, even for a majority of policy solutions. That's a huge sea change in the history of conservatism. It doesn't mean that it is irresolvable, but it does mean that the only way to resolve that tension is to have conversations. And for conservatives and libertarians and people who don't even like those labels to stop shooting at one another and to remember that our common enemy, and I use the word enemy on purpose, would be the radical leftists in charge of the regime in Washington, D.C. today. Let's go defeat them, and then we can have our dancing on the head of a pin conversations about policies, because then we'll be in power. And then we, hopefully, by being in power, our policies can lead to human flourishing. It's a huge source of frustration for me that rather than aiming our fire at the left, that we conservatives, we're all to blame for this, will often want to shoot one another so we can look a little bit better on Twitter. And it's high time that we realize we've got to displace the regime in Washington, D.C. today. Otherwise, these conversations among conservatives, libertarians, et cetera, are purely academic.
An element of that defeat, when it comes, not if, but when it comes, will of course be the reacquisition from a coalition standpoint of the working class to the conservative coalition, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith. You're a son of Lafayette, Louisiana. I think it's fair to say a working class city, if I can describe it. You say that with pride, and a lot of us here are as well. Not sons of Lafayette, but sons of the working class. Talk to me a little bit about how the working class has come back to the conservative coalition. And I don't mean from a partisan standpoint, because obviously this is not a partisan question, but what role does that play in defining what conservatism is, and why is it happening, and where does it end?
Well, one good fruit from the sometimes frustrating conversations that we conservatives are having with one another right now is that the impetus for a lot of these conservative thinkers is grappling with working class conservatism. And I love that because that's who I am, it's who you are, it's probably many people in this audience. It cuts across race and ethnicity, which is good. We need more things in this country, cutting across race and ethnicity to touch many Americans. And the point is this, for those of us who are children of the 80s, as you and I are, we came of age as conservatives because Ronald Reagan put his thumb on what later Rick Santorum and then Donald Trump and then others described as working class conservatism. That is, getting back to the smallest unit in society, taking care of the problem, that unit closest to you, local government, or even better, no kind of government. How about a civil institution, a Rotary Club, a church, taking care of the problem? Well, what's interesting is that Donald Trump, who is not a working class conservative, understood that. And he understood that, ironically, because he understands the free market, but far more importantly, he understands what has made America great. What's made America great over our couple of centuries plus is the willingness to be pragmatic when we're looking at policy solutions and not to feel like we're existing in this straitjacket when it comes to exerting power. The downside to that, and this is the tension that we're going through right now, and it comes back to working class conservatism, is the knee-jerk reaction to overuse the federal government. That's the kind of thing we have to be very wary of as conservatives, even with ourselves, even with friends, including some of the political leaders I've mentioned, because that, as we know, can have very dangerous consequences on working class Americans.
Echoes of Shelby Foote's invocation of the American genius for compromise. Very good.
That is exactly right.
Well, so I want to pivot a little bit to talk about a generational question. You mentioned we're children of the 80s, which was the best decade, but there are those who have not had that fortune. You and I think it's fair to say we've seen America work. We saw the victory in the Cold War. We saw victory at war. We saw the Reagan era. But the generational experience for the largest ever numeric cohort of Americans, which is late millennials plus Gen Z and beyond, is quite different. If you look at a median American who's born 1990 or after, it's in some sense a series of disasters that punctuate their lives. Worst economic recession since the Great Depression, 2 wars that weren't quite won, one in which there was an outright defeat, and you can kind of go on in the bills of particulars. What do we say to those as conservatives, and what does the conservative movement have to offer in a vision to a generation that hasn't seen America work in the same way that you and I did?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge in intellectual honesty that all of those episodes lead to a tremendous skepticism by very thoughtful people who otherwise want to love this country. And I think part of having a more productive conversation as Americans, as conservatives, is for those of us who are sons of the 80s, who have seen huge strides made, and our patriotism is almost natural for us to acknowledge, without being mean bald guys, that for those people who are younger than us and who are conservatively minded, that America doesn't seem to be as great. And one of the reasons it doesn't seem to be as great is because what's happened on our watch is the dramatic centralization of power in Washington, D.C., including among nonprofits who are conservative, who contribute to this swamp culture. And so I get the frustration. In fact, I don't just get the frustration, I'm frustrated by that too. To fix that, though, means we have to remember where conservatism is at its best, because it's where public policy is at its best, and that's at the state level. And so to fix the swamp, to fix conservative Inc., to fix whatever that description of centralized power in the nation's capital is not to go play in Washington, D.C., but to rejuvenate in our local communities and in our state legislatures a desire to drain the swamp from the 50 state capitals. That's the future of conservatism. As a result, because we're sitting here in Austin, we know that can go pretty well. I'm very optimistic about the future.
That's a great answer. I agree with all of it. And yet, you're moving to the swamp. So talk to me about that. I know your heart, and I know your pattern of thought, but I think it's worth talking a little bit about that. You're going to the Heritage Foundation, which is a venerated DC nonprofit. It's been around for a long, long time. And there is a certain strain of conservatives out there who say it's pointless. It's pointless to go to DC. It's pointless to do things in DC. Anything DC is intrinsically the problem. Why there? Why now?
Great question. Maybe because I'm a little crazy. No,
it's a fair answer.
Yeah, okay, very good. Look, I was reflecting on this the last month, and I realized that I'm just a contrarian at heart. And I have always, professionally speaking, run to where the gunfire is. And so I was a conservative Christian Ph.D. student at the University of Texas, literally the only conservative of the 300 or 400 graduate students in that program. And rather than study something that was safe, I don't know what that would have been there, maybe the Constitution, I studied African American history. First of all, because I found it interesting. But secondly, because I loved looking at the faces of the left of center white elites who thought that a white guy from Lafayette, Louisiana couldn't do African American history. And obviously here at TPPF, we always go to where the gunfire is. And even when our conservative friends, for example, in the legislature say, we just passed tremendous property tax reform, we say, no, you didn't. And don't mean any offense by that, but we're just going to tell the truth. We're going to go where the gunfire is. The point is that because TPPF is in great shape, and because I also happen to try to say yes when the Holy Spirit calls, going behind enemy lines right now is what I feel called to do. And it's unfortunate that the nation's capital would be enemy lines, but that is the case. It's also really crucial, and here I'll wrap up this response, that even though it's true that the most important policy reform for conservatives is going to come from state capitals, that we have to have as a movement a beachhead in the nation's capital. Because if we're going to succeed in this 60-year-long desire of conservatism to end the welfare state as we know it, not merely to save money, but to benefit tens of millions of people's lives, we're going to have to take state reform to the nation's capital, and we have to have partners there, like the Heritage Foundation, who can carry that banner there. In other words, the Heritage Foundation can and will be better at fighting behind enemy lines as a result of our state-based groups doing our jobs well. And conversely, with the knowledge that the Heritage Foundation is willing to charge those hills with the ammunition from the state-based groups can do their jobs better. This is why I'm optimistic about the future. It's also why, in spite of the fact that I don't want to leave Texas, I'm willing to do it, because I believe that each person in this country owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to America. And if the sacrifice my family and I have to make is to live near the nation's capital, we're willing to do it. Not to mention that the Heritage Foundation is the most formative institution in my lifetime as a conservative. So it's a great privilege to be starting there on Wednesday.
Heritage is one of the great achievements in branding. I'd say over the past two generations, the name alone invokes rightly an inheritance, right? And so this idea of history. So I want to ask. We're about to get to Q&A, but I want to ask a history question of you. The left, and when I say the left, I mean the whole left, government, media, academia, and so on, is making an extended argument about history because they see it as the crux of their attack on the American way of life. And one of the arguments that they advance, one of the core arguments that they advance, that history is just the stories we tell ourselves, not necessarily moored to a factual underpinning. How do we beat that, and what do you think of it?
Well, we have to scale back 2 generations of really poor history teaching in this country. And the way you do that, unfortunately, it's a long-term solution, is starting at date certain today, you have to start teaching history well, because you can't love what you don't know. And that's why all of these parental rebellions against critical race theory, sex education, indoctrination around the country, these are all organic. This is just like the Boston Tea Party in the 1770s. It's the same motivation. People saying, you can't do that. To hell with you. This is my country. That's the kind of energy that conservative organizations, if they are smart, will harness and turn into a movement that completely upends what the elites in Washington want us to believe, which is that they control our lives. And it's now time for us to stand before history and say, hell no.
Outstanding. I'd like to go to Q&A. So we have microphones here in the audience. For those of you on the live stream, we have a live audience here, and we have a gentleman raising his hand wearing a black hat, but he's a good guy anyway. Go ahead, Rafa.
Well, thank you for that, Josh. Kevin, it's been a pleasure to serve with you. I really appreciate it. But you know that I'm a straight shooter. I'm going to ask you what perhaps is a tough question.
Is this your prelude to putting me on the spot?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Just to get you used to it, because I know you're going to be on the spot continuously in DC. There's a narrative, or a perception out there that conservatism is only for white America. Okay. Do you see an opportunity to help dispel that perception, that narrative? What can be done to have Americans of all kinds, particularly non-white Americans, help with the embrace of conservative values?
Great question, Rafa. Thanks for your own efforts, your entire career along those lines. Yes, I mean, there's not only an opportunity, I would argue there's an obligation for conservative organizations, I might say, starting with the Heritage Foundation and the Texas Public Policy Foundation, to make sure that conservatism and conservative organizations reflect the populace. All you have to do is spend 5 minutes in Texas to know that conservatism isn't just for Anglos. Conservatism is for everyone. And there are many reasons that conservative political campaigns have not succeeded in permanently building a coalition that's truly working class and multi-ethnic. We're on the cusp of doing that. One of them is that because they're political campaigns, they pander. And rather than pander, we need to spend more time persuading people about the truth of our ideas. Because these are, remember, these are policy prescriptions, temporary necessarily, but they're tethered at their best to permanent things, which is a way of saying they are tethered to something that's wired on our nature, on our souls. Every human being, regardless of their skin color, possesses that. We just don't always attempt to make the sale. And that the salesmen can be people who look like me, they can be people who look like you, they can be people who look like our friend, Dr. Richard Johnson. The important thing is they look like America. And so whether at Heritage or at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the people asking for the sale, so to speak, people asking for the support need to do so, A, in great authenticity, B, with policy prescriptions that work, and C, they need to reflect the population at large. I see that happening in Texas. And I see that two organizations we've talked about today doing a good job of that. I think we have the opportunity to do a great job in the next decade. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. What other questions do we have? There you go.
Kevin, what will your top priorities be when you start at Heritage?
Thanks for that question, Sarah French. Education, education, and education. And by that, I mean, if we don't, as a movement, tap into the dissatisfaction, to be polite about it, that tens of millions of Americans feel about government schools, we've missed the opportunity of a lifetime. And we don't deserve to be raising money on other important issues. We're going to do that. Heritage is already doing that. TPPF is already doing that. I think we're going to see school choice enacted in so many states in 22 and 23 as a direct result of the left overreaching. But that leads to be a little less sarcastic, a couple of other priorities. Secondly, I think big tech is an enemy of the state. And I think that Americans are looking to organizations, especially in DC, and particularly the Heritage Foundation, to take them on. And so, game on. And thirdly, being a son of the 80s, if we, in all the work we do here at TPPF and Heritage, don't start speaking about China as the great threat in our lifetime that the Soviet Union was in our childhoods, we're not only missing an opportunity, we're going to get our clocks cleaned. And so under my leadership at Heritage, you will see us continue to work on the spate of issues that we have, as we have here at TPPF, but education, big tech, China, really are top of mind for me because they're the biggest threats if we don't get them right.
Question in the back, Brian Phillips.
Kevin, in talking about the future of conservatism, I want to ask about future conservatives. Given that, as Josh mentioned, so many of those industries, so many of our young people are highly influenced and highly exposed by those industries that are run by the left, whether it be academia, tech with social media, certainly Hollywood and entertainment. How does an organization like Heritage, or even just organizations within the conservative movement, our institutions, how do you plan to fight back with those industries that are so highly influential and gaining in more power? How do organizations like Heritage or others within the conservative movement, certainly at TPPF, what's your sort of 30,000 approach way to that those institutions can fight back?
Well, great question, Brian. Thank you. As succinctly as I can, it starts with upending those institutions that have been co-opted by the left. And so we just have to recognize a really ugly reality as conservatives. In our lifetime, for people our age as Josh, most of the institutions, really once noble institutions in this country, have been taken over by the left. And they have now become vehicles of indoctrination of mistruth. Vehicles of indoctrination for socialism, and I mean that very intentionally, not as a pejorative, and vehicles of indoctrination of anti-American thought. Those need to be deleted. And the only way to delete them, and I'm getting to the heart of your question, is to invest time and resources in new institutions. The Hillsdales, Grove Cities, Wyoming Catholic colleges are small places. We need to increase them by number, by 300, 400, 500-fold. Secondly, we need to take great solace in the fact that homeschooling is increasing almost exponentially in the last decade. And this isn't just 10 million atomized individual little families. These are people working in co-ops, investing in their churches, reestablishing Rotary clubs, starting gardening clubs. We're going to see in the next 10 years, this is the point, a revitalization of American community life. If conservatives are really paying attention, and that means not looking at DC so much and looking at where they can really tap into this energy, they're going to be looking in local communities for those new soldiers of the conservative movement. The difficulty, which you appreciate better than anyone because you're a communication specialist, is reaching all of those audiences without having one entity, one institution to go through. And I think that's where conservatives have a great opportunity looking ahead, is how we communicate with them. You can look at, for example, the Youngkin campaign in Virginia, just speaking about it as a campaign, yet to see how he's going to govern, if he's going to govern as conservatively as he campaigned. It's often a wariness we have as conservatives, but they found a way to communicate to those various groups that I think is a real yardstick for us as we move forward. But the main thing is, whether it is what I've mentioned or the growth of charter schools, conservatives need to embrace these disruptive innovators. Those are our people, even if in the coffee shop, they don't sound like they talk like us. Kind of goes back to Rafa's question too. Those are our people because in their gut, they know there's something wrong in this country. And what's wrong is that not only is there centralized power, but those people in power are telling us they need to stay there forever. And now it's time for us to tell them to go pound sand.
Who's next? Dr. Vance Ginn of the Wall Street Journal. Go ahead.
Kevin,
are you from the editorial page, sir?
Yeah. Quick question. Kevin, thank you for everything, and thank you for your tutelage over the years, mentorship, and for the lessons and history lessons as well. Those will stick with me and with my colleagues as well. Given that I'm a free market economist, and we've had a lot of good discussions along the way, and I'm wondering, in addition to some of the issues you just mentioned as being top items, what about the budget? With being $28 trillion in national debt, soon be $29 trillion. If we didn't fund a lot of these things, we couldn't do them, whether it be regulatory state, other sort of budgetary areas. And as Reagan said, government's not the solution, government's the problem. And it goes back into some of that free market discussion we had earlier, which I'm not an anarchist. I think there's some roles for government that's there. But given if we get too much into government, it leads into more of the debt that we have. And so how do we start to balance some of these things and really go at it such that the public will begin to understand more about what the government's doing and what the budget is?
Couldn't agree more with your rationale, Dr. Ginn, so thanks for the question. So I'll cut straight to the solution. The conservative movement has to, for this generation of activists, thinkers, economists like you, find that budget, that solution to the budget problem that we can all support. I happen to think it's an idea that you've been championing, the responsible American budget. And what I love about that is that it recognizes that in order to get out of this huge problem, a huge threat to the American way of life, which is the size of the federal budget, we have to start chipping away at it. And by date certain, some years in the future, we can get back to a steady state of government living within its means. What I love about that is it ties to another goal that we have here at this organization, and soon a goal of the Heritage Foundation, and that's safety net reform. That, in other words, the larger point, Vance, is that we would all love if we could snap our fingers and government overspending and safety net systems that have imprisoned Americans into permanent dependency would be gone immediately. But we've taken 60 years to build them. It's actually inhumane as conservatives to snap our fingers and do that. But it's equally inhumane for us to sit on our derrieres, our backsides, and do nothing. And it's really time for us to be bold and say that by 2040 or 2045, not only is our federal budget going to be 50% smaller, safety net programs will truly be just safety nets. What all of us, given our Christianity, given our American spirit of helping others, believe in, but they have to be smaller, not merely for the sake of spending money, but for the dignity of the human people who are on those programs. That is a much better America, and that's the kind of thing conservatives need to be talking about.
I love this conversation because it is the gateway to your eventual reluctant embrace of cryptocurrencies.
Well, I started trading cryptocurrency, but I haven't figured out if I'm good at it yet.
And you walk out the door as soon as it happens. Breaking my heart. Last question goes to your successor, but not your replacement. I think you would agree with this, Greg Sindelar.
Kevin, well, first, I think I speak for everyone when we're so grateful for your service, not only to TPPF, but to the state. And when I was thinking about what question I wanted to ask you, first I was thinking maybe I'd ask, how could the University of Texas fix its football program?
You're asking the right guy.
But I figured I'd go something a little easier, something you talk about each week when you do your live stream. And you touched a little bit on this earlier, but I'd love to hear from you why, as conservatives and more importantly as Americans, we should be optimistic about the future.
Greg Sindelar, thanks so much. Thanks for stepping up with your number being called. And I'll say, before answering the question, thanks to all of you here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for being great colleagues and friends. We will, of course, continue to work together in a little bit different way. I remain optimistic, first and foremost, because of my faith, which is a gift from above. Some friends of faith, some friends not of faith say, how do you have faith? I say, I don't know. I've always had it. It's just a gift that the Holy Spirit gave me. And so I happen to know that we win in the end, which means that I'm willing to lay it all on the line in this life. And the second thing is building off of that, and to a point Josh made earlier about inheritance. Aristotle suggested that we ought to labor in gratitude for what came before us, for what was given us. And America could be hopeless. America could be god-awful rotten, and I would still be willing to give my life for it, as I know tens of millions of you would. And the third thing is, I look around the conservative movement, and I see the broadest movement in my lifetime. Broadest geographically, broadest in terms of the percentage of men and women, people of color, working class, rich, in between. I don't see a whole lot of people with Ph.D.s in the conservative movement, but that's probably a sign that it's a good thing. And what that tells me is that if all we do is not screw it up, we're going to win. And if several people are willing to stand up and say, on policy X and on policy Y, this is true north and this is where we're going, and conservative organizations decide we're going to work together towards those aims, rather than say, no, that's my issue, you go back to your sandbox, I think we're going to win. And I also think we're going to win because a majority of Americans realize that the nation's capital is broken. And I look forward to arriving in DC tomorrow and hastening its demise.
Dr. Kevin Roberts, I think I speak for everyone in the auditorium, on the live stream. And by the way, if you're on the live stream right there, don't change that dial. We're going to be back in the new year with something new and great for you, because the fight for Texas continues. But thank you for your service, for your leadership, and your friendship in the fight for the Lone Star State. We look forward to much more.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.